The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The Case of the American Cowboy by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Bryan Godwin. Whenever I opened my own medical practice in May 1887, I had taken over the premises of Dr. Farquhar, who had gone into retirement due to health issues. I had started seeing Holmes rather rarely at times. The fact that I had been happily married for a few months and set up a cozy home with Mary in the same house, on the floor above the reception and treatment rooms, also kept me from taking part in Holmes's activities. Because of my private idol and professional progress, this did not seem to me to be a loss at all. Rather, I felt like I was entering a quieter part of my life at the right moment. I often only learned of Holmes's investigative activities from the newspaper, but their short and patchy reports, with all due respect to the journalistic craft, were never as detailed as mine, and, of course, could never be. Special circumstances, however, led me to assisting Holmes again in 3 cases during the summer months, which brought me back to the certain taste of adventure that I have missed out on. It proved difficult to escape the fascination that my friend had in the long run. Finally, in September, we arranged for a meeting to discuss my future participation in Holmes's investigation. But to my surprise, we didn't meet that evening for a cozy dinner. When I picked up Holmes at the agreed time in Baker Street, he showed me 2 tickets to what I think was a rather peculiar show that had been talked about all of London for several weeks. The American cowboy William F. Cody, Army Scout and Bison Hunter, which is why he also performed under the name of Buffalo Bill, staged the so-called Wild West in an unquestionably spectacular performance. It was as if the circus was in town, only 100 times bigger. Mr. Cody had brought a lot of company from the United States for his European tour. Hundreds of background actors representing cowboys, pioneers, Indians, and cavalry soldiers. A small orchestra of its own, which mainly intoned the Yankee Doodle. 300 horses, a small herd of buffalo, and a larger herd of cattle, donkeys, deer, and various exotic animals, including silver lions. The journey across the ocean must have resembled the ones on Noah's Ark, and the land route must have been close to Hannibal's elephant train across the Alps. In reality, I later learned, Cody crossed the Atlantic with a steamship named Nebraska, and on the European continent, he traveled with his own trains, and with no less than 30 train wagons. I didn't really know what to think of Holmes's surprise invitation to Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and especially what his plans were, but I agreed. And in the evening, we found ourselves among tens of thousands of enthusiastic visitors on the grounds of the American Exhibition in West Brompton, where the spacious exhibition center of Earl's Court had only recently been built. The seats on the stand that contained an unmanageable crowd of people were on the first row just a few feet from the arena, which was simply separated by a low wooden planking. That did not change from the fact, the kind of enjoyable show we were about to see. Cowboys caught calves with the lasso, performed acrobatic feats on galloping horses, and clung to the backs of raging bulls. Indians of different tribes, allegedly Sioux, Cheyenne, and Pawnee, performed dances around a totem pole, throwing knives and tomahawks with remarkable precision, surpassed only by the white snipers, including a woman who all had very modern rifles. The mighty bison were driven over the trembling ground, and a snarling puma was tamed, while a large brown bear of the Rocky Mountains strolled on a leash through the arena rather unmotivated. The greatest effort, however, was undoubtedly put in the reenactment of the battles. General Custer's devastating defeat at Little Bighorn was staged as a bloody carnage by the Indians, and in return, the blue-uniformed Yankee soldiers were completely accord in regard to the depicted brutalities when they had to save a settler trek from an Indian raid. Of course, they did not use real ammunition. Buffalo Bill led as a sort of storyteller on horseback through the show, scalped a few Indians, naturally for the show, and personally led, while pulling his saber, a cavalry into battle. I too let myself be taken a little captive by this spectacle. Of course, I didn't start to chuckle and clap all the time, like much of the audience, but I watched with great excitement the meticulously planned and rehearsed scenes that were precisely executed and followed a very well thought-out script. It was planned out very well from the grand spectacle down to the smaller details. Highly professional showmen were at work, and Mr. Cody was their undisputed general. It did not surprise me at all that even Her Majesty the Queen and the Prince of Wales had attended this spectacle with great joy, and, as it was at least written in the papers, personally complimented Mr. Cody on afterwards. Only one man was apparently not in the least interested in what was happening in the arena. Holmes sat next to me with his eyes closed, his chin sunk on his chest. His right hand supported his forehead. One might have thought that he slept through all of the noise, smoke, and fire. The final highlight of the performance was an Indian raid on white settlers who marched through the prairie with their wagons. With waving flags and trumpets, of course, the U.S. cavalry should rush to the rescue. And so the settlers hid in their chariots, while the Indians rode around in circles on their mustangs and shot their arrows, and that at breathtaking speed, because the horses were constantly driven to full gallop. When the army's attack fanfare sounded, the first Indians fell to the ground, probably hit by the bullets of the advancing soldiers. It certainly took a certain ability to control the boy to fall off a horse as skillfully as they did to avoid a serious injury, and at the same time dying on stage credibly. In one case, however, things should be different. Towards the end of the battle, in the meantime, the soldiers gained the upper hand. Some of them had already come to fight man against man with knives, axes, and sabers. One of the fleeing Indians, who wore an imposing feather ornament on his head, rode particularly close to our audience, and even though I didn't hear a gunshot at that moment, the man suddenly fell off his horse, flipped over several times, and crashed into the wooden boundary right in front of our chairs. The audience raved about this supposedly successful spectacle. Holmes, however, was suddenly back in his element. He immediately rose to see the fallen man at the wooden boards. "The man doesn't move," Holmes said. "Well, he probably died according to the direction of the director," I first suspected, and also got up to catch a glimpse. But then I saw that a pool of blood was already forming in the sand around the Indian's head, which certainly could not be part of the show. "There's something wrong with that," Holmes said. "I think the man needs a doctor." At first, I didn't respond to Holmes's remark until he hit me in the ribs with his elbow. "Dr. Watson!" he shouted directly into my ear. In view of the roaring final applause in the arena, "What was your profession again?" Now I immediately ran to the wooden boundary and climbed over to look for the accident victim, Holmes following me close. I reached the man after a few seconds, kneeling down and turned over the still motionless body on his back and started looking for any vital signs. But in vain. The man had died, and there was nothing I could do for him. "He's dead," I declared, and straightened up again, while the applause of the enthusiastic audience pierced my ears. No one in the stands had heard of the tragedy that had happened during the show. Within half an hour, the spectators left the area in an orderly fashion and headed home, emotionally incensed by the spectacle and with newly acquired expert knowledge about life in the Wild West of North America. Holmes and I, of course, stayed with the victim, and we quickly managed to get the attention of the show's staff. The first arriving colleagues, whether cowboy or Indian, were concerned, but also knew that their profession brought certain dangers. And of course, this wasn't the first accident in the history of Buffalo Bill's Wild West tour, and not the last. And yet the matter was immediately declared as a concern of the boss. William Cody himself appeared at the scene of the accident to get a picture for himself and interview us as witnesses. In the meantime, the body had been covered with a horse blanket. Mr. Cody was a man of just 40 years, and yet the experiences he made showed that he had, at least, triple the life experience of an average man. He wore a uniform that had the patches of a colonel on his shoulder. His real trademark, however, was his mustache swirled over his lips and his chin beard that was cut pointedly, which seemed rather medieval compared to modern European fashion. "Howdy, gentlemen," he greeted us as he approached and shook hands quite jovially, but with very firm pressure. "You have observed the cause of the accident?" "Exactly," I confirmed. The man rode close to the rows of spectators and then, without a reason, fell off the horse and hit the wooden boards. There he came to lie down. I knew immediately that something was wrong, so I rushed in to help the man. You must know, I am a doctor. But he must have been dead immediately. Before Cody could say anything, Holmes interjected. "Am I right in assuming that this fall was not intended for the programmatic course of the battle?" The colonel nodded thoughtfully. "That's the way it is," he replied. "The man had the role of Ghost Dog, the chief of the Lakota. According to the script, he was to be picked up and captured by me on the run at the end of the battle. When I saw that he was already lying on the ground, I had to improvise, which almost ruined the finale of the show." "I'm certainly certain that Mr. Ghost Dog regrets his unprofessional demise," I replied cynically. "It certainly won't happen again." "Excuse me, Doc, if I'm impious," Cody replied, "but I have to keep a massive company going, on which hundreds of jobs depend, as well as the income of many families. We have about 300 shows here in London, and then we'll move on to Birmingham and Manchester. Without a certain emotional distance, I couldn't lead this tour. However, I can assure you that the death of Ghost Dog is very close to my heart. He was kind of a friend." I refrained from apologizing and muttered only, "I understand." At that moment, a cowboy brought in the horse of a fallen man he had captured. It was a magnificent pinto mustang, albeit a little small for a horse by English standards. Cody took the reins and said, "Thank you, Bob." Immediately, Holmes began to walk around the horse and inspect it closely. He moved the crooked saddle, which was easy to move, and looked at the animal's belly, and Cody watched him suspiciously. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I'm investigating the cause of the accident," Holmes said, "and if you had the goodness to bend down here, I can present you with an interesting fact." Cody did as he was asked, and immediately saw what Holmes had discovered. "The saddle girth. It is severed," he said. "Well, that's an explanation for the accident. It probably tore." "If you take a closer look," Holmes corrected, "then you'll notice that the loose ends aren't frayed, as it would be the case with normal wear and tear, but cut smoothly, like cut with a knife, almost up to the end. The last bit of the girth actually tore during the show. This was the planned sabotage, and not an accident at all. It was murder." "A murder? Impossible!" The colonel was completely perplexed and silent for a few seconds, but after he thought about it, he said, But you're right. The cinch was actually cut with a knife. A remarkable observation, sir. You might be able to compete with your famous fellow countryman, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." I laughed briefly and said to Cody, "Well, then I guess it is time to introduce ourselves. My name is Dr. John Watson, and this gentleman here is indeed Mr. Sherlock Holmes, a consultant detective to London." Again, the colonel briefly lacked words, but then he laughed. "Oh, what a remarkable coincidence of fate!" he exclaimed. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, it is a great honor and joy for me, even if the circumstances are not at all pleasing." With these words, he shook our hands vigorously a second time. After a pause for thought, he continued, "A murder? An assassination attempt on Ghost Dog. Who could have done that? I don't understand. What am I supposed to do now? Maybe we should just inform the police, I suggested. Yes, indeed, Cody muttered. But the investigations, the questioning, the scandal, the buzz, the newspaper reports, is there no other variant that would be a little more subtle? What happened next was inevitable, and Holmes replied, well, there is a possibility. Cody looked at Holmes with a serious expression. Apparently, he was thinking hard, and then his face clearly lightened up. You mean, Mr. Holmes, you would take over the case? Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. But Holmes, I wanted to protest, but it was already too late. Dr. Watson and I, Holmes continued, we are happy to take up the investigation. We will start immediately and begin with the investigation of the body. Oh, that's great, the colonel exclaimed enthusiastically, sealing the agreement with another handshake. The lifeless body of Ghost Dog had been brought to a tent within a few minutes and laid out in the tent. They provided me with a doctor's cutlery, water, and wipes. Cody, Holmes, and I gathered around the makeshift observation table. Please go ahead, Holmes asked me to go to work. Addressing Cody, he said, you need to know Dr. Watson is an excellent forensic pathologist. I'm not, I growled quietly, more for myself, and began to cleanse the victim's head from the blood. The Native American facial features that appeared were sharply cut, the cheekbones protruding, the cheeks invaded. Willpower and indomitability were reflected, but also the great mystery about the history and origin of the Native American population, about which we knew so very little. After all, and at least this may be partly to be credited to Colonel Cody, the Indians are now only rarely regarded as soulless, uncivilized barbarians who would have just emerged from the animal kingdom, but at least as noble savages to whom one admitted a certain degree of culture and wisdom. The rampant race theory, which is particularly popular in the United States, Russia, and Germany, probably puts the Indians one step above the dark-skinned inhabitants of Africa, but settles them below East and South Asian groups of people, and of course, far below the white peoples of Europe. Those views, in any case, which pseudo-scientifically try to construct a Nordic ruling race among the peoples of human beings, fail because of their own bizarre banality. If it were so simple, it would not ultimately be the Germanic supermen of the Hyperborean Scandinavian bloodline at the forefront of human evolution, but the Samian reindeer nomads of Lapland and the Eskimos of the Arctic. But such nonsense emerges when self-proclaimed anthropologists unknowingly distort, mix, and reinterpret Darwin, Lamarck, and Mendel to the unrecognizable. In the end, there is not much more scientific substance to be found in race theory than among the beliefs of divinely chosen peoples, be they Hebrew, Western Christians, or Muslims. Holmes noticed the digression of my thoughts during the examination and brought me back to the immediate reality. Dr. Watson, he exclaimed, what can you tell us about our murder victim? Well, there are deep injuries to the skull, I began, setting aside the feather headdress, undoubtedly fractures that stem from the impact against the wooden barrier, but this may not have been the cause of death. The man apparently broke his neck when he fell from the horse, with his spinal cord severed. He was instantly dead. Can put to the protocol, Holmes asked, that there is no other unusual wound, such as a gunshot wound? My eyes quickly examined the almost naked body. Nothing like that, I replied. The reason of death lies in the unfortunate fall. Holmes thought for a moment, then said, we already know that the fall itself was not an accident, but the result of sabotage on the riding equipment. But it was uncertain beforehand that the fall would actually lead to death. What could have also happened was that this man did not break his neck. There is a possibility that he could have survived this with a permanent injury or paralysis. This means that the assassination attempt was an unsafe one, an unprofessional one, if you will. Fate had to play its part. Cody understood Holmes's clue and immediately picked up. Well, certainly, the perpetrator had to accept this slight uncertainty. However, I can assure you, Mr. Holmes, if a man falls off the horse unplanned at full gallop, the chance of a fatal injury is by no means small. I understand, Holmes said. The next thing that irritates me, a little, is the fact that Chief Ghost Dog was on the road with saddles and stirrups. Don't Indians ride directly on the back of the horses, at most on a small blanket? The colonel hesitated with his answer, then declared, You caught me, Mr. Holmes. This is indeed a small inaccuracy, in a sense of artistic freedom, if you will allow it. And the bitter irony is that it was actually a safety measure to equip Ghost Dog's horse with a saddle. Because of the daring maneuvers he had to perform, we thought this was appropriate so we could minimize the risk of a fall. And that security is what cost Chief Ghost Dog his life, Holmes muttered, before turning straight to Cody again. I have 2 more questions. Who had the opportunity to manipulate the saddle? And who would be interested in Ghost Dog's death? Cody answered immediately. The second question, I have no idea, he said bluntly. Ghost Dog was respected among his colleagues, whether white or Indian. He was a brave, talented, and respected man. Of course, personal conflicts occur when you go on a month-long tour away from home with 300 men, but overall we're more like a big old family. 3 hours ago, I would have vouched for all my employees. Now, of course, at this stage, I'm not so sure anymore. I, for myself, had the impression that Buffalo Bill's family was more of a community of Native Americans and whites, a business model for mutual benefit. The Lakota participating in the show under their chief Ghost Dog, whose actions were, to say the least, ambivalent, probably needed their additional wages. Despite all the reservations, they too could hardly escape the civilized Anglo-American money economy in the long run. The next moment, a white-haired old Indian with a furrowed face entered the tent wordlessly. Immediately, he began to hum an unmelodic chant, blowing smoke from his pipe into the air, walking around the corpse. Then he covered it with small pieces of jewelry carved out of wood. While doing this, he completely ignored us. It seemed like we were not present at that time. It seems to me that the autopsy is over, I laconically stated, stepping back from the dead man's body. There was nothing more to investigate anyways, so I refrained from using the provided scalpels. That's White Horse, Cody said, whispering, so he would not disturb the process. He's the shaman of the Lakota. He will now accompany Ghost Dog's spirit into the afterlife. Then it would be appropriate, Holmes suspected, to withdraw respectfully. The colonel nodded, and we left the tent, from which the sonorous buzz of the medical man could still be heard. When we gathered some distance, Holmes said again, If it is at all convenient, Colonel, I would like to return to my question from earlier. Who takes care of the horses and the riding equipment of the Lakota, and especially the chiefs? And who would have had the opportunity to put their hand on the saddle strap of Ghost Dog? I can in no way imagine that he has anything to do with it, Cody said. But the person in charge is Lame Duck, the older brother of Ghost Dog. His brother? Holmes repeated softly. That's interesting. Meanwhile, I intervened in the conversation. 2 questions, Mr. Cody, if you will allow it. First, if Lame Duck is the elder of the 2, why isn't he the chief? And secondly, does the poor man not have somewhat of a disrespectful name? The colonel laughed briefly, then replied, You know, Doc, these 2 questions can be easily answered in one go. The matter of becoming chief among the Indians does not work as easily as the succession amongst English monarchs. The oldest son is not automatically the heir, but skills and achievements are required. And as far as Lame Duck is concerned, he's had a lump foot since his earliest childhood. He limps when walking, as you will see. He can hardly walk, jump, or climb faster. Riding also causes him some difficulties. You will understand that these are not the best conditions to lead a belligerent Indian tribe that thrives on hunting. That is also why he carries the name Lame Duck. It somewhat resonated the subtle Indian humor, but by no means is it supposed to be disrespectful. Lame Duck is a highly respected man among the Lakota, whose advice is gladly sought. I understand, I replied, and I had little choice but to believe the colonel's remarks. But in a way, Holmes came forward before I could say anything else. Well, he said, where can we find Mr. Lame Duck? I would like to talk to him. Of course, Cody replied. He'll be at the stables and taking care of the horses, as he always does after the show. Follow me. Since we had previously been in the area of the main gate of the arena, we reached the somewhat remote barracks with the horses of the Lakota only by circumnavigating half the area below the stands, which meant a quick walk of a good 10 minutes. When we arrived at the stables, the colonel approached an Indian man who turned his back on us and was working a horse with a brush. That's Lame Duck, he whispered to us. I'll introduce you to him. Then he shouted, How Cola! And put his hand on the Indian's shoulder. The following few words which the two exchanged in the Sioux language could not be heard for us. Eventually, he turned around and waved at us. Gentlemen, he said, may I introduce Lame Duck of the Lakota tribe, brother of Ghost Dog. The man was, at least on the outside, much older than his brother. He had a wrinkled, weather-tanned face, long, stranded hair, some of which were already graying, and strangely empty eyes. Good evening, Mr. Lame Duck, Holmes began. Allow me to express my sincere condolences to you for your brother's death. But the addressee only looked at us rigidly. The North American Indians have a less dramatic relationship to death than we do, Cody explained. Death is a natural part of the circle of life. Lame Duck is by no means unmoved, but only composed. Holmes nodded sympathetically and turned back to the Lakota. As I heard, you are responsible for taking care and providing for your tribe's horses, aren't you? Once again, Lame Duck's face showed no emotion, nor did he open his mouth to talk. He looked in mine and Holmes's face for several seconds, then finally gave us a slow nod. Beautiful, shouted Holmes. So I note you do speak our language. Would you be kind enough to answer a few questions? And again he repeated his actions. He stared at us for a few moments and then slowly nodded. I'm afraid this might take a little longer, I said, halfway joking. But Holmes wasn't irritated. I suppose that even today you saddled your brother's horses, he continued, and without waiting for another reaction from his interlocutor, he immediately asked, and the saddle girth was still intact at that time? For the first time, Lame Duck's eyes showed a little uncertainty, but only for a fraction of a second. Then he nodded calmly again. Of course, Holmes had noticed this fact, which is why he gave me a meaningful look before turning back to Lame Duck. And where were you at the time when your brother fell off the horse? Of course, it was a reckless misconception to think that he would actually speak to us. Instead, Lame Duck stomped his foot on the ground. I assumed it must have been his healthy one. He was here, the colonel translated. Holmes thought for a moment and then asked, From where did the Indian raid on the settlers begin? Where did the warriors ride into the arena under Ghost Dog's lead? That was the main entrance, Cody said immediately, around the vicinity of the tent with Ghost Dog's body. There our Indian performers climbed their horses and rode into the arena. It had to look like a sudden onslaught, like a planned ambush. That means, Holmes noted, the chief's horse was taken to the main entrance during the performance. That's the way it is, Colonel confirmed. During the show, everything has to go fast, and the number of our horses is limited for financial reasons. If I have the schedule right in my head, then the Mustang in question was used at the Battle of Little Bighorn. He was then brought here via the side exit, prepared within a few minutes for the next performance, which means also newly saddled, and led under the stands to the main gate, where it was handed over to Ghost Dog. For a few moments, Holmes put his head on his chest and closed his eyes, while Cody was a little worried about this, and Lame Duck looked like he did not care. I knew, however, this was about a very elementary conclusion. Holmes raised his head again and said, "Well then, the case is clear. If, as Mr. Lame Duck confirmed, everything was still in order with the saddle, the sabotage can only have happened on the way from here to the main entrance. So all that remains is the question." But Holmes couldn't finish that sentence. To his and my surprise, he was interrupted by Lame Duck, who declared in impeccable English, "It was me. I did it." "What do you say?" asked Holmes, who is otherwise rarely thrown off focus. "Really? You cut your brother's cinch?" Lame Duck, however, had returned to non-verbal communication and only responded with his familiar slow nod. Holmes pinched his eyes thinking, while I, a little helpless, said, "Well, I think that's kind of a confession." Despite our hesitation, the colonel was forced to act. He resolutely approached Lame Duck and talked to him briefly in the Lakota language. The Indian then disappeared. "You're not going to let him run away, are you?" I asked, since I did not understand one single word. "I instructed Lame Duck," Cody said earnestly, "to go to his tent and stay there at our disposal." "And if he makes a bolt for it?" I asked. Cody shook his head. "You've gotten the wrong impression, Doc. You know neither the Lakota nor Lame Duck. That would never come to his mind. It is a matter of honor for him to accept house arrest. I told him that the questioning would continue soon. However, he will only talk under one condition." Suddenly, Holmes awoke from his seemingly absent thinking and asked, "A condition? What condition?" The colonel laughed. "Well," he said, "Lame Duck has expressed a desire to be questioned only by the medical man." "From the medical man?" I repeated incredulously. "Is he talking about the shaman, Whitehorse?" "No, Dr. Watson," Cody replied. "He was talking about you." Only a few minutes later, I was alone with Lame Duck in a cone-shaped tent. We sat on leather-covered cushions, lying on the floor. Between us, a small but cold fire pit. The only light sources were the 2 oil lamps we had with us. Holmes and Cody waited outside the tent a few feet away. For my own safety, they stayed within reach. I must confess I did not feel absolutely comfortable with facing the Indian without accompaniment. The Lakota culture was completely foreign to me, although it seems, sometimes, it looked quite similar in Pashtun tents in Afghanistan. All my knowledge of the natives of North America came from James F. Cooper's novel, The Last Mohican, which I had read with enthusiasm in my youth. But I was aware that this kind of literature was far from ethnographic research. And, of course, every strangeness, every unknown thing, brings a certain distrust, which corresponds to the human tendency to be cautious. Moreover, let us not forget that my counterpart had just confessed to a murder. But right at the beginning, our meeting took an astonishing turn. When I sat on my seat cushion, Lame Duck's facial expression changed for the first time. He smiled very kindly at me, and I tried to reciprocate that gesture. Then he offered me a wooden bowl with a pink liquid, and of course, I took the jar and drank to ensure a trusting situation. But it tasted disgusting, and I had to make a great effort not to let on. As I later learned, it was a thin liquid juice made from the fruit of the vinegar tree. Eventually, Lame Duck signaled that he was ready for the conversation by spreading his arms. "Mr. Lame Duck," I began, "you confessed to the crime. Why?" The very unrevealing answer was, "That's a strange question, John Watson. I admitted it because I did." Why did you do it? I continued. Lame Duck responded with another question. Is the English medical man obliged to maintain confidentiality? Well, I replied, there is definitely something like medical confidentiality. However, you are not my patient, but a murder suspect. In this case, this rule probably does not apply. I understand, Lame Duck replied. Then I cannot answer that question. Ask another question, John Watson. I was a little confused and tried to rearrange my thoughts. Finally, I was able to continue and asked, You said that the cinch at the stables was still undamaged, so when did you cut the cinch? This claim was false, Lame Duck replied. I apologize for that. I have already cut the girth with my knife at the stables. Why didn't you tell the truth right away? I continued. The Indian drank from the pink juice and put the bowl between us again. Then he said, That was a misunderstanding. I briefly pondered whether this claim was credible. Without coming to a final view, I continued with the questioning. Mr. Lame Duck, could I see your knife you used to make the cut? But the Indian calmly replied, I'm sorry, I don't have it anymore. It got lost. Lost? I repeated. What a happy coincidence. After all, it is evidence. You don't need any proof, Lame Duck replied. I don't deny the act. I've already confessed to it. Certainly, I said immediately. But in general, we like to base our cases on something like a foundation. Lame Duck looked at me without understanding. What better proof can there be than the word of a man? I don't want to appear disrespectful, I replied, but I've had the experience that sometimes people don't tell the truth, for very different reasons, and I'm not sure about you yet. Are you telling the truth? The Indian didn't mince his words. Why should I lie? Tell me, I replied. Lame Duck shook his head. You have to ask a different question. I can't answer that. You don't make it easy for me, I said, muttering. Well, you are aware that the murder of a person entails a punishment, aren't you? A harsh punishment? Once again, the Indian took a sip of the vinegar tree juice and then declared, I am aware of that, and I am ready to accept the punishment on me. It is worth it. With these words, he handed me the drinking bowl again. I politely sipped on the brew and understood that this was the sign of the end of the conversation. Thank you for welcoming me, I said as I stood up. However, I fear that I cannot do anything for you. You will be held accountable for the murder of your brother. That's how it will be then, Lame Duck replied, unmoved. As it is, it's good. Thank you for your time, John Watson. With mixed feelings, I left the tent and made the short way to Holmes to discuss the situation with him. I obviously did not succeed with bringing us further along in this case. Holmes and Cody listened carefully to me, talking about the contents of the conversation with Lame Duck. The colonel was the first to take a position. I am aware that he has confirmed his confession, he said when I had finished my remarks. But it still seems incredible to me that he killed his own brother. Lame Duck was always a thoroughly peaceful man. Holmes, for his part, remarked, I don't think it's up to me to judge the character of the alleged perpetrator, which in any case could be misleading. I am sticking to the facts, and they still lead me to certain inconsistencies, or at least unanswered questions. Before Holmes could move on to clarify the problems of the investigation, a young boy approached us. He was at most 14 years old, with straw blonde hair and perfect cowboy attire, including lasso and bowie knives. He seemed very upset and stormed towards Cody. Colonel, he shouted in a desperate voice, you must not allow anything bad to happen to Lame Duck. He did nothing. The boy clutched Cody and began to cry. Well, Harry, Cody replied, while calming him down while caressing his head. We're not going to make any hasty decisions. That is also the reason why these two gentlemen have taken up the investigation. The boy looked at us shyly and asked, Are you from the police? You don't look like sheriffs. Cody laughed and explained, May I introduce? These are the famous detective Sherlock Holmes and his collaborator Doc Watson. They are here to investigate the incident. Holmes approached and reached out to the boy. "Howdy," he said. "I'm happy to meet you. May I also know your name?" But the boy was too frightened to answer, and therefore the colonel did it in his place. "This is Harry, Lame Duck's adopted son." "He's white," I said, which was certainly not too difficult a realization. "Yes," Cody replied. "Harry's mother died shortly after his birth. His father was a soldier at the Battle of Little Bighorn where he died. Little Harry, an orphan at the time, all alone in Wyoming when he was just 5 years old, was picked up by the Lakota, cared for, and finally accepted into their tribe. And now he's part of our troop. He helps Lame Duck at work." "That's very nice," Holmes praised, addressing the boy again. "You said earlier that your adoptive father had done nothing. What do you mean by that?" Harry wiped tears from his face and gathered all his courage. "He didn't cut Ghost Dog's cinch. Certainly not." "How do you know that?" asked Holmes. After all, he admitted to it. "But he can't have been," cried Harry in a tearful voice. Cody put his hands on the boy's shoulder and said, "Well, it is very good and brave of you that you defend Lame Duck with such fervor, but unfortunately the facts speak a different language." "He did nothing," repeated Harry, burying his face in his hands. "Then tell me," replied the colonel, "why are you so sure about that?" "Because he knows who the real perpetrator is, and that Lame Duck is trying to cover someone with his false statement," Holmes said. Then he turned to Harry again. "That's true, my boy, isn't it?" Harry hesitated, looked up at Cody, then towards Holmes, and nodded tentatively. "Yes," he whimpered. "You don't have to be afraid," Holmes continued. "Please tell us exactly what happened." The boy took a deep breath, then began. "There was an argument between Lame Duck and Ghost Dog." "Why?" asked Holmes. "Because of me," Harry replied. "The chief said that the depiction of the Battle of Little Bighorn should be revised, because neither the Indians were so bloodthirsty, nor the whites so brave. On the contrary, they were cowardly and tried to flee. Lame Duck admonished his brother not to say such things in front of me, because it would make me sad. After all, my father was among the fallen. All victims should be treated with respect, whether Indian or white." "I suppose," Holmes suspected, "Ghost Dog didn't understand that." Harry shook his head. "No, he didn't," he said. "The chief became angry and called his brother a submissive traitor who denies the history of his own people. But Lame Duck insisted that the time of war was over and that a peaceful coexistence had to be found. The prerequisites for this would be to forgive and forget. Ghost Dog then punched him in the face and called him a useless cripple who would not survive a minute in battle. Then he stormed away." "To me, sounds like a motive," Cody said. "This observation hardly serves to relieve Lame Duck, rather on the contrary." "Stay calm," Holmes replied. "We don't know the whole story yet. I would also like to point out that I have been aware for some time that Lame Duck is the offender." "How do you know that?" asked the colonel, who slowly became impatient. "Why does everyone always claim to know anything? Will there ever be some sort of clarification?" Holmes had to smile. "Certainly, Colonel," he said in a calm voice. "You will probably remember that Lame Duck had assured us that Ghost Dog's girth was still intact here at the stables, which led me to conclude that the sabotage was carried out along the way from the stables to the main entrance of the arena. But Lame Duck and myself immediately became aware of this, and therefore he revised his statement. But even if he made the confession, it does not seem at all possible for him to carry out the deed. He would not have been able to bring his brother's Mustang over quickly enough with his limp foot. He had to delegate this task to a reliable assistant. Lame Duck must have seen that he had stopped for a second on his way to cut through the girth. Then he turned directly to Harry. "Would you show me your bowie knife?" The boy hesitated for a moment, then took the knife out of his belt and handed it over to Holmes. He immediately passed it on to me and asked, "Dr. Watson, can you, as a forensic scientist, identify this knife as a weapon of crime?" "Yes, I can. I lied without flinching. With this knife, the girth of the Mustang was cut, the jagged blade and traces on the cinch match. Harry, my boy, Holmes continued, do you want to tell us the rest of the story now? The boy began to cry again, but gathered and reported what had happened. Yes, it's true. I cut the strap on the way to the main entrance with my knife. Then I delivered the horse and handed it over to Ghost Dog, who didn't notice anything. But when I returned to the stables, Lame Duck confronted me. He said he had seen everything, and I might have done a lot of damage. When the news of Ghost Dog's death finally reached us, he said I shouldn't worry, because he would make it right. But he cannot take the blame for my mistake. I did, all by myself. I highly appreciate that you want to stand up for your actions now, Holmes said of the boy. It's very brave. Of course, this does not change what happened. A man died through your actions. I'll never forgive myself for that, cried Harry. I didn't want to do that. After the chief had called Lame Duck a useless cripple at the end of their dispute, I just wanted him to experience what it's like being a cripple. I didn't want Ghost Dog to die. I just wanted him to get hurt and maybe get a lame leg. Then he wouldn't talk to Lame Duck like that. Holmes nodded twice. As far as I'm concerned, he explained, I believe the boy. He just wanted to teach Ghost Dog a lesson. That this would lead to such an accident was beyond his ability to assess. But the killing remains real and must have consequences. I, for my part, would regard this case as solved now, Colonel. You have to decide what to do next. Thank you, Mr. Holmes, replied Cody, who was clearly touched by these revelations. The following is going to happen. I ain't going to involve the British police. We're going to settle this matter internally. This means, since all parties are members of the Lakota community, that the tribal council should make a judgment on the punishment of the boy. Because there is one thing you need to know, my dear Harry. Those who are old enough to commit a crime are also old enough to receive punishment. The details, however, are no longer within my influence. With this, our case was done, and it was high time, because we were slowly approaching the midnight hour. Tired, but also somewhat agitated, we started our journey home. Colonel Cody had promised to visit us the following afternoon to inform us about the decision of the tribal council, which was to meet in the early hours of the morning. The unfortunate Harry was handed over to the care of his troubled adoptive father, Lame Duck. The next morning I slept a little longer, because the long evening before had been quite exhausting. My practice remained closed that day, and after a late breakfast, I left my home in Paddington, and, as agreed, went to Holmes on Baker Street. There I was already expected by my friend, who was at first pretty tight-lipped, one might say almost like a certain Indian. This did not change when the colonel appeared at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and so it was up to me to offer our guest a cup of tea. But the colonel waved off. I'd love to have something more effective, he said. Firewater? I asked, smiling at my own joke. Cody nodded unmoved, and so I filled him with a glass of fine Scotch from Dufton, which our guest immediately emptied in one go. Apparently, our American cowboy was used to something else, though. He shook his body in disgust and shouted, I should have brought for you a bottle of down-to-earth bourbon from Tennessee. Still, thank you. For the sake of courtesy, I didn't let on to anything, but I think that this was a typical example of the uncivilized but all the more arrogant way of a typical Yankee. Out of sheer defiance and British patriotism, I immediately gave the colonel a second glass. Holmes had watched the scene with amusement, lit a pipe, and then inquired about the outcome of today's Lakota meeting. Did the tribal council come to a verdict on the boy? Yeah, they have, Cody said. In the course of the morning, after a lengthy discussion, the council decided to exclude Harry from the Lakota community and to expel him. This is a very tough decision. The boy must now go his way and can no longer expect any support from his previous tribe. His adoptive father, Lame Duck, is also prohibited from helping him. I understand, Holmes said, who seemed a little concerned, though A more lenient sentence was hardly expected. So Harry has to bear the consequences for his ill-considered emotional actions. But what does that mean? I interjected. What will happen to the boy now? Harry will be sent back to Wyoming, the colonel said. Tomorrow, accompanied by Lame Duck, he will board a ship to New York. They will travel on to their home village where the boy will be provided with the most necessary means of survival and then sent away on his own. That's awful, I shouted. The boy will hardly be able to survive in the prairie. Cody laughed. My dear Doc, he replied, the Wild West is not quite as wild as you might imagine. There are white settlements, small towns, military bases, and cultivated land. I can also tell you that I will not let the boy down, especially since the Lakota decisions do not apply to me. I intend to give Harry a job at a horse ranch so that he can make his living. If he works there and shows himself willing to learn, he will be able to lead a decent life. He's still young, and America is the land of unlimited possibilities after all. This is an extremely caring and good deed, I said approvingly, but why are you doing this? I came to the conclusion, Cody said after a brief pause, that I share responsibility for what happened. That controversy that led to Harry's act arose from my script for the depiction of the Battle of Little Bighorn, and it is indeed a little one-sided and historically inaccurate. Does that mean you're going to adapt the show? I asked. How Ghost Dog wanted it? The colonel shook his head. No, not at all, he replied in a resolute tone. I'm a businessman. The show must go on and be successful. We have to show the audience what they want to see, and they want to see bloodthirsty Indians and brave whites. There may come a time when this is no longer the case, but until then, I am forced to manage the company so everyone can make a living. Anyways, I'm still a big protector of the rights of Native Americans, even against the will of the government in Washington. Apparently, the Indian proverb that whites speak with a split tongue was entirely justified, and Colonel Cody was the personified example of this. In the Indian Wars, he had certainly killed countless natives in cold blood and combat, and he was not prepared to critically question himself for these crucialities. At the same time, he made a sincere effort to ensure that the Indians were given a worthy place in, or at least on the fringes of the new world of the United States, where they could live in peace. I kept these considerations for myself and just replied, I understand. Since you mentioned show business, Cody continued, clapping his hands, I'd have an offer for you, Mr. Holmes. Until now, Holmes had seemingly absent-mindedly sat next to us. All of a sudden, he raised his head. An offer? He asked. What kind? I'm talking about your cases, your adventures, the colonel said. I learned a lot from the papers that those were the most highly spectacular stories. But there's a lot more to it. I think that if they were professionally told in the form of a short story or a novel, you can make a lot of money. Just imagine the title, The Adventures of the Ingenious Detective Sherlock Holmes. This could turn into a worldwide bestseller. The audience would love it. Success guaranteed. Bloody murders, nefarious perpetrators, secret conspiracies, dangerous investigations, unexpected twists, brilliant solutions, and enlightenments by the master detective, garnished with a little humor by a lesser-minded assistant. What? I shouted indignantly, but Cody's flurry of speech was unstoppable. And think beyond the printed word, the colonel continued. Illustrated stories, stage plays, musical theater, exhibitions, devotional sales. Yes, even a crime show with you as the performer of yourself would be feasible. We could also join together for some of the adventures, Buffalo Bill and Sherlock Holmes in a joint investigation. You could go on tour with me. That would make you filthy rich. Think about it. Holmes smiled politely and said, Thank you for the honorable offer, Mr. Cody, but the show business is not for me. I am a man of facts, not of exaggeration, and as far as the literary perpetuation of my cases is concerned, I already trust in the skills of my assistant. But the prospect of extreme wealth, replied the colonel, that does not convince you? Holmes shook his head. No, I have everything I need for me to live and work. Well, Mr. Holmes, Cody replied disappointedly, I want to respect your decision, of course, but you miss a great opportunity. Seems to me that you Englishmen lack a bit of business acumen. But anyway, if you change your mind, don't hesitate to contact me. If necessary, Holmes promised, you will be my first person. Thank you, Cody replied with a confident smile as he pulled an envelope out of his jacket. This is your fee for investigating Ghost Dog's death. If you take advantage of my offer, you could earn 10 times this pay. With these words, he wanted to hand over the envelope to Holmes, but he refused with a corresponding hand gesture. If I think about it, Holmes said, then I don't even need that sum. Would you be so kind, Mr. Cody, and give the money to Harry? He will certainly need it more. Of course, as you wish, the Colonel replied. He put the envelope back in, took the whiskey glass, shook his head as a precaution, drank it again in one go, and slammed the glass on the table in a cowboy manner. Maybe I could get used to it, he said, reaching out to Holmes. Goodbye, Mr. Holmes. It has been an honor. Holmes rose from his chair, grabbed his hand, and replied, My pleasure. Then the Colonel made his way to the door and waved to me with the words, Farewell, Doc, and left the room. After William Cody left us alone, we sat together for a while to recapitulate the case and especially its background. The questionable treatment of the government and the Army of the United States with the Native Americans left me no peace. But Holmes managed to teach me something better and to reconcile relations. We should not boast too much of our enlightened European progress towards the dull and immoral Americans, he said. Until 1776, it was soldiers of the British Crown who regularly expelled, mistreated, and killed Indians. Believe me, my dear Watson, for the Indians, it doesn't matter if their oppressors wear red or blue uniform skirts. In addition, don't forget about British-ruled Canada. Not to mention the conditions of our colonies in Africa, Asia, and Australia. Even in Ireland, our troops, landowners, and governors behave like colonial rulers to inferior peoples, and the other imperialist nations do not do it any better, whether French, Spaniards, Dutch, or Germans. May I remind you of our experiences around the Berlin-Congo Conference? For heaven's sake, Holmes, I replied, just don't talk about it. As you wish, Holmes said, taking a short break. Then he began, Actually, we wanted to meet yesterday for a different reason, right? That's right, I confirmed. It would have been about my future participation in your investigations. You will be pleased to hear, Holmes said, that you will be immediately reintegrated in the near future, at least temporarily. In this respect, I have already started everything. What do you mean? I asked, quite a little suspicious. I mean, Holmes replied, that of course it's okay for me that you move back in with me. I have already had your room prepared. But Holmes, I said, irritated, I have my own home, and there, among other things, a wife. I know, Holmes replied calmly, but your wife will soon go on a trip and visit her aunt, won't she? I frowned and muttered, How do you know that? Holmes did not respond to this question, but continued. You may also be interested to know that our visit to this unspeakable Wild West show yesterday was the perfect distraction. Distraction? I stammered. What about? What for? I allowed myself, Holmes explained in a completely harmless tone, to have most of your clothes and private things brought here to Baker Street during the show to spare you the trouble. I hope the surprise has been successful. It was, Holmes, I sighed. It was indeed. You are very welcome, Holmes replied. By the way, if you want to hurry to Paddington now, you could say goodbye to your wife. The departure has been accelerated. Accelerated? I asked, completely clueless. When? Damn, Holmes, how do you know that? Whatever. I jumped up, stormed out of the room, and down the stairs to stop the next best carriage on the street. With difficulty and hardship, I arrived at home just in time to accompany my Mary to the train station. After that, I bowed to my fate and moved back into my old room on Baker Street, temporarily. Addendum. For years, I was wondering about the future fate of young Harry. That's why I finally conducted research that, about 10 years after the events of the Buffalo Bills Wild West show in London, revealed the following information. Harry, with full name, Harry Alonzo Longabaugh, actually worked, as arranged by Colonel Cody, on a horse ranch in Crook County in the Wyoming Territory. Within a short time, however, he got on the wrong track and shifted to stealing horses. For this offense, he served 1.5 years in prison in a town called Sundance, which derived its name from Lakota's ceremonial Sundance, and is also in Crook County. Back on the loose, he briefly tried again as an honest rancher worker in Alberta, Canada, but soon after, he apparently joined a notorious bandit group that is known as the Wild Bunch of robberies and is led by a certain Butch Cassidy. Since then, Harry has apparently been called Sundance Kid, probably in memory of the place of his first prison sentence or as a reminiscence of his childhood with the Lakota Indians. I couldn't find out more about him, and I very much hope that he will find a way to end his life as an outlaw.